They thought a petty HOA fine would be enough to make me cave to their power-hungry demands. What they didn't realize was that they just picked a fight with the chief of police. And when I started pulling at the threads of their so-called authority, uncovering a disturbing operation targeting our neighborhood's first responders, well, let's just say it became clear. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Welcome to my channel. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'll never forget that morning. It began like any other, quiet, routine, but by sunset, everything in our neighborhood had changed. I was headed out for my shift at the police station, coffee in hand, when I noticed something neon green tucked beneath my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just another menu from the local Chinese takeout, but the moment I read the bold letters across the top, my stomach dropped. A violation notice, $79 for improper lawn maintenance. You've got to be kidding me. I stood there, in uniform, staring at my lawn. It looked the same as it had for the last 15 years. Lush, green, freshly mowed. No, it wasn't perfectly manicured like some high-end golf course, but it was neat, healthy, and respectable. That's when I heard the sharp clack of heels on concrete. A sugary voice followed, laced with just enough venom to make your skin crawl. Good morning, Karen Mitchell, our newest HOA board member. She'd only lived here 6 months, but somehow managed to get herself elected onto the board within weeks. And now, 3 weeks into her reign, she was already turning the neighborhood upside down. I gave her a polite nod and held up the bright green ticket. Mind explaining this? My lawn is well within normal standards. She didn't even glance up. Section 7, paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is roughly 3.5, she said, still tapping away on her tablet, likely logging her next victim. I took a breath, drawing on my years of experience dealing with hostile suspects. I've had a major case at work. I'll mow it this weekend. Rules are rules, she chirped, finally meeting my eyes. And just so you know, the fine doubles if it's not paid within 72 hours. She turned away, but not before delivering one last blow. Also, those garden gnomes on your lawn? They're not approved decorations. My stomach tightened. Those gnomes had been part of our yard for years, collected by my late wife. I held my composure. I wasn't aware we needed permission for lawn ornaments that have been in place for over a decade. New board, new rules. She gave a cheerful wave with her tablet. We're modernizing the neighborhood. No more outdated decor dragging down property values. As she walked away, she stopped at my neighbor Sarah's house. Sarah, an ER nurse, had just come off a grueling night shift. The last thing she needed was Karen photographing her trash bins for being out too long. And just like that, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about grass length or gnomes anymore. After 25 years in law enforcement, I know how to spot a pattern, and this was harassment. Not random, but targeted. Back in my car, I opened the neighborhood Facebook group. Sure enough, post after post complained about Karen. Mark, the firefighter on the corner, had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. The elderly couple across the street, penalized for their rose bushes. Even the local teacher was cited for parking his unsightly car in his own driveway. I was just about to pull out when I spotted Karen snapping more photos of my gnomes. That's when I knew she'd crossed the line. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my career, it's that the most dangerous threats aren't always the ones that make the evening news. It's the slow, quiet erosion of trust and community spirit. As I drove to work, my mind was already spinning. Karen thought she had control, but she had no idea who she was messing with or what I'd uncover once I started peeling back the layers of her so-called authority. 2 days later, it escalated. I came home from a grueling double shift, having spent 14 hours working a downtown bank robbery. All I wanted was to pull into my driveway and collapse into bed, but instead 2 black SUVs were parked in front of my home, completely blocking my access. The words HOA security were stamped across the doors, and standing on my front lawn in a designer blazer and those same high heels was Karen Mitchell, once again snapping photos of my property like she was gathering evidence for a crime scene. She had no idea the crime was about to be hers. I watched from inside my car as Karen strutted across my front yard like it was her personal runway, dressed head to toe in designer attire. Her tablet was in one hand, the other snapping pictures of everything, from my garden hose to the welcome mat my wife once picked out. Each click of her camera chipped away at my patience, but I didn't let it show. 2 decades in law enforcement had taught me that losing your temper rarely solves anything. I stepped out of the car, my voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, you're blocking my driveway, and I need to access my garage." Karen turned sharply, her perfectly curled blonde hair bouncing like she'd stepped out of a shampoo commercial. "Well, well," she said with a smirk, "if it isn't Mr. Johnson, our neighborhood's most consistent rule breaker." She tapped her screen with long crimson nails. "Let's see, unpaid lawn violation, unapproved gnome placement, and now," she paused for effect, "non-compliant mailbox color." I laughed, incredulous. "Mailbox color? It's white. It's been the same white for the 15 years I've lived here." She tilted her head as if I were missing the obvious. "According to the updated guidelines, which passed just last week, all mailboxes must be painted pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company collection. Yours is clearly classic white, a completely different shade." She beamed, proud of herself as if she'd just cracked an unsolved homicide. I pulled out my phone and began recording. "Karen, I get that you're new here, but those vehicles are parked illegally. You're blocking access to private property, which violates City Ordinance 20-345. For the first time, her confidence wavered, just a flicker. Then it returned. "As an HOA board member, I have full authority to enforce our community's standards," she said, motioning toward two men in poorly fitted uniforms, leaning lazily against the SUVs. "These officers are here to ensure compliance." That's when I noticed something strange: their badges. At first glance, they almost looked official, but something was off. As the chief of police, I'm familiar with every licensed security firm in the area. Mitchell Security Solutions wasn't one of them. I took another steady breath and tried one last time to reason with her. "Look, I understand you're trying to keep up appearances, but blocking someone's driveway over a $79 fine isn't just excessive, it's unlawful. I'd really prefer not to escalate this." Karen's face flushed to match her nails. "Is that a threat, Mr. Johnson? Because I have photographic evidence of every violation on your property, and the board will be very interested in your aggressive tone." She turned to the guards. "Make note of his hostile behavior." They clumsily reached for their notepads. As they did, I spotted their shoulder patches starting to peel. Cheap, like something printed at a local copy shop. My instincts flared. Something about this whole setup stank. I opened the city's business license database on my phone and began searching while keeping an eye on Karen. A few taps later, the truth was clear. Not a single security company existed under her name or her brother's, whom I'd seen at the last board meeting in a similar knockoff uniform. That's when Mrs. Garcia, my neighbor, came rushing out in her nurse's scrubs. "Chief Johnson, thank goodness you're here," she said breathlessly. "They're blocking my driveway too, and I'm already late for my shift at the hospital." I turned back to Karen just in time to see the moment the word chief registered. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. Her grip on the tablet faltered. But instead of backing down, she stiffened her spine and lifted her chin with artificial confidence. "Your title doesn't change anything, Chief Johnson. HOA rules apply to everyone equally. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish documenting these violations and prepare the fines for your uncooperative behavior." She turned on her heel, clutching her clipboard like a shield, and walked off without another word. But I knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Her little HOA empire was built on flimsy authority and unchecked arrogance. And now that I had seen the cracks, it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. I was going to find out exactly how those security measures had been approved. I never thought a petty lawn complaint would lead me to uncover something so sinister. That realization hit harder the next morning when I opened my front door to find Sarah, my neighbor 3 houses down, and a dedicated ER nurse on my porch. It was 6:00 a.m. She was still in her scrubs, eyes red and shoulders trembling. "Chief," she whispered, holding up a fistful of orange notices. "They're threatening to place a lien on my home. I left my trash bin out 1 extra day because I was working a double shift after that bus crash yesterday." She looked exhausted, broken. After saving lives for 16 straight hours, she came home to harassment over garbage bins. That's when I knew. This wasn't about order. It wasn't about community standards. It was about control. Seeing Sarah like that, barely holding herself together after 16 straight hours of saving lives, only to come home and find herself threatened over garbage bins, that lit a fire in me, and she wasn't alone. As I began quietly asking around the neighborhood, more stories poured in. Mark, the firefighter who lived on Maple Street, showed me a stack of citations he'd received. Every one of them was for his kid's basketball hoop. The same hoop that had been sitting harmlessly in their driveway for 5 years, completely unbothered until Karen stepped into power. The Martinez family had been fined because they left their Christmas lights up for 2 extra days. They'd been out of town, attending their grandmother's funeral. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, fanning out every complaint like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And just like a puzzle, the picture became clear. This wasn't Karen being detail-oriented or modernizing the neighborhood. This was targeted harassment. She was going after residents with demanding schedules. Nurses, firefighters, doctors, teachers, people who worked odd or long hours, the ones who didn't have time to play watchdog over their mailboxes or garbage bins. My instincts took over. I started mapping out each citation issued since Karen took over the board, just 3 months ago. The results were staggering. Clusters of violations concentrated around homes of emergency workers and residents who had opposed her during the board election. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate, strategic, malicious. Just then, my phone buzzed. A message from Tom, my deputy and a longtime friend who lived in the neighboring subdivision. "Chief, you're not going to believe this. Remember that drainage problem last spring? Turns out Karen's brother's company got the contract for 3 times the cost of the other bids." I leaned back in my chair, that smug look on Karen's face from earlier flashing in my mind. Rules are rules, she had said, like it was some holy commandment. But now I knew better. These weren't rules. This was a thinly veiled power grab hiding something far darker. Just as I processed the text, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chen from across the street, an elderly widow who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. She looked over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. "Chief," she whispered, "they're installing cameras on the street lamps. Karen says it's for security, but they're all pointed at certain houses, including yours." My jaw tightened. Unauthorized surveillance in my jurisdiction. This was no longer about fines or decorations. It was an abuse of power that now teetered on the edge of criminal. But I couldn't act just yet. Karen would twist it, make it look like I was using my position to target her. I needed airtight evidence. I walked Mrs. Chen home, trying to stay composed. As we approached her front door, I noticed Karen down the street, chatting with 2 men I didn't recognize, both wearing uniforms from her brother's so-called security firm. But something about them felt off, too casual, too unprofessional. My gut churned, and after 20 years on the force, I've learned to trust my gut. It almost never lies. I thought back to something my old mentor used to say: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Karen had built herself a little kingdom, a petty empire of fear, fines, and intimidation. But in doing so, she made one fatal mistake. She got arrogant. She got sloppy. What she didn't realize was that while she was watching us, we had started watching her too. And this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about exposing the rotten machine behind her. As I looked at the growing stack of evidence on my desk, printed citations, HOA meeting minutes, screenshots from residents, I knew the next HOA emergency meeting was going to be one for the books, especially when they found out who had just been appointed to the county's Housing Authority Oversight Committee, quietly and without Karen's knowledge. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing through the mess Karen had created and the damage she'd done to people just trying to live their lives. The next morning, sipping coffee at the kitchen counter, something clicked. A phrase from my rookie days came to mind, one I hadn't thought of in years. Follow the money. The security company that had blocked my driveway, barked orders, and issued bogus threats. They'd been far too eager to do Karen's bidding. At the precinct, I asked Jenny from Records to run a basic business lookup on elite neighborhood watch services. Within minutes, the results came back, and they confirmed what I'd feared. The company had only been registered 3 months ago, right after Karen joined the board. The listed owner? Same last name as Karen's maiden name. And the business address? A P.O. box. No real office. At lunchtime, I swung by Sarah's house. She was just pulling into the driveway, eyes heavy, exhaustion clinging to her like fog. "Chief," she called out, forcing a tired smile. "They left me another notice this morning." She held out the slip, hands trembling. "I can't afford these fines, not on a nurse's salary." Her voice cracked. And in that moment I knew, we were way past the point of petty citations. This was war. Sarah handed me a thick stack of violation notices, all signed by Karen. Each one cited obscure, selectively enforced HOA rules that seemed oddly focused on working-class residents. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about community standards. It was about targeting the people least able to fight back. Back at the station, I dove headfirst into public records. What I found didn't surprise me, but it still made my stomach turn. Karen's brother, Tom Mitchell, had a long and shady history of failed security firms. 3 different states. Each time the pattern repeated. Complaints about intimidation, unauthorized vehicle blocking, and aggressive behavior. And each time the company vanished before an investigation could stick. I knew I needed more. So I paid a visit to the county clerk's office. Mrs. Rodriguez, the friendly clerk behind the counter, helped me pull the HOA registration files from the last 6 months. I flipped through the documents, and there it was. Bold and undeniable. Karen had never disclosed her relationship to the owner of the security company when her board voted to award them the contract. That was a direct violation of the HOA's conflict of interest policy. But then I struck gold. Curious, I checked the registry for Karen's home-based business license. To my astonishment, she had been running an unlicensed daycare out of her garage, watching up to 6 kids at a time. The irony? HOA bylaws explicitly forbid commercial activity in residential homes. The very same rules Karen had weaponized against neighbors for running quiet home offices. And worse still, she wasn't even licensed with the state as a child care provider. As I absorbed the weight of what I'd uncovered, my phone buzzed with a new message from Mark, the firefighter. "Chief, you need to see this." He sent a photo. Karen's security vehicles parked directly in fire lanes throughout the neighborhood. If we had an emergency, we couldn't get a truck through. That was the last straw. The rest of the afternoon became a whirlwind. I printed property maps that showed Karen had illegally extended her backyard fence 2 feet beyond her property line. I reviewed cruiser camera footage documenting her security guards blocking access for emergency vehicles. I pulled financial records from the HOA that proved Karen had been pushing for higher fines, while steering every single security contract to her brother's company. The evidence wasn't just stacking up, it was towering, but I had to move carefully. Karen had allies on the city council, and the last thing I needed was for her to spin this as a personal vendetta. Every step had to be by the book, so I made copies, paper and digital. I encrypted the files. Years in law enforcement had taught me, always prepare for the unexpected. Just as I was finishing, Officer Rodriguez burst into my office, eyes wide. "Chief, you're not going to believe this," he said breathlessly. "Karen's guys tried to boot Dr. Thompson's car at the emergency room entrance. He was rushing in for a surgery." My blood boiled. That was the final piece. I leaned back, staring at the wall of evidence. Karen had spent months weaving her web of control, convinced she was untouchable, but she had no idea how close she was to collapse. The only question that remained, when? When to strike, and how to ensure the fallout would be irreversible. Right on cue, a new message lit up my phone. Karen just submitted a proposal to expand security patrols. Emergency HOA meeting set for tomorrow night. Sergeant Blake. I smiled. Perfect. Sometimes the most effective investigations are the ones where you let your target walk straight into the trap they set for others. The next evening, I entered the HOA meeting with my heart pounding, but my expression calm. The room was packed, tense, quiet, wary. Karen stood at the front in her usual designer outfit, smiling as she waved us around her new community safety initiative. She spoke of installing more cameras, hiring additional guards, enforcing stricter codes. The audience looked exhausted, but no one dared speak up. Until she finished, until it was time to vote. I stood, the weight of my badge in my pocket grounded me. "Before we vote," I said, "I think there's something the board and the community deserves to know." Karen's eyes narrowed. She didn't recognize me in plain clothes. "I'm Chief Anderson," I said, "and I've been quietly investigating a series of troubling developments tied to this board's recent actions." I held up a folder as the projector behind me clicked on. On the screen, a photo of Karen's illegal daycare setup, bright, undeniable. "These images," I said clearly, "show an unlicensed childcare operation being run out of Mrs. Mitchell's garage. That violates both HOA regulations and state child safety laws." Karen turned crimson. "How dare you? This is private property," she barked, clutching her stack of proposals. I didn't flinch. "Public records aren't private," I replied calmly, turning to the next slide. "And neither is this business license registry, showing that your brother owns Safe Shield Security, the same company now patrolling our streets without a valid license." The room began to stir. Whispers turned to murmurs. People were waking up. I flipped to the next slide. "This business registration," I said calmly, confirms that Safe Shield Security is owned by your brother, the same unlicensed company that's been patrolling our streets, issuing citations, and blocking access, all without proper legal authority. The room erupted in whispers, gasps, murmurs, exchanged glances. It was like a spark had lit a fuse. But I wasn't done. I stepped forward. While you were fining Sarah Thompson, an ER nurse, for leaving her trash bins out after 16-hour shifts, you were operating an illegal daycare from your garage. While you cited Mark Rodriguez's kids for their basketball hoop, your so-called security team was breaking every rule in the book. Mrs. Chen stood up from the back of the room. She fined me 200, she said, voice trembling with emotion, for hanging Chinese New Year lanterns. One by one, voices rose. Neighbors who had once felt isolated in their frustration now found the courage to speak. Parents talked about chalk drawings, retirees, about garden gnomes and bird baths. The room swelled with indignation and shared outrage. Karen, desperate, reached for her papers and made a break for the exit. But Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president, stepped in front of the door. "Not so fast, Karen," he said, firm but composed. "We're going to talk about this." I presented the final slide. "This company," I said, pointing at the image of their vehicles blocking fire lanes, "has been issuing tickets and restricting property access without any legal authority. That is impersonating law enforcement, and it's a criminal offense." Karen's polished facade shattered. "You can't prove anything," she shouted. "I was making this neighborhood better. These people need rules." "Yes," I replied, "but rules apply to everyone, including you." Applause exploded across the room. Mr. Jenkins raised his hand. "I move for an emergency vote to remove Karen Mitchell from the HOA board immediately and to ban her from ever holding office in this neighborhood again." "Second," came a chorus of voices. The vote was unanimous. Karen stood frozen, her face drained of color. Clutching her handbag, she shoved past the crowd, her voice rising over the chaos. "This isn't over." But it was. As I looked around the room, neighbors embracing, smiling, some even crying, I knew something had changed. We had reclaimed our community. Sometimes justice wears a badge. Other times it's just a neighbor who stands up and says, "Enough." Later that night, I stayed behind to help Mrs. Thompson, the retired school principal, begin the long process of overturning every bogus fine. The total? Over 115,000 worth of citations, each more absurd than the last. Neighbors stopped by with coffee, cookies, and quiet words of thanks. For the first time in months, the mood felt light, hopeful. The next morning, as I drove past Karen's house, a moving truck sat in her driveway. Her brother's black SUVs were gone. In their place, legitimate patrol cars, ensuring the movers had proper clearance. Word spread fast. And with Karen gone, life started to return to normal. Kids played in their yards again. People left their decorations up without fear. Mrs. Thompson even organized a community barbecue to celebrate the return of, well, common sense. But the moment that stayed with me most came a week later. I was watering my lawn, yes, still 3.5 inches tall, when Sarah's young daughter ran up to me holding a homemade card. Inside was a crayon drawing of me in uniform, standing proudly in front of a rainbow-colored house. Her message read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." That card sits on my desk to this day. A reminder that sometimes the most important police work doesn't happen in a patrol car or an interrogation room. It happens right at home. And as for Karen, last I heard she tried to join another HOA board 2 towns over. But somehow, they'd already heard all about her time with us. If this story moved you or reminded you of something happening in your own neighborhood, don't stay silent. Share this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that reveal the power of standing up for what's right. Your voice matters, and together we can make a difference, one story at a time.